Hi everyone, my name is Maya Chen. I'm 34 years old and I live alone in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, with my cat Butterscotch and more houseplants than any single person probably needs. From the outside, my life looks pretty ordinary, quiet even. But if you'd seen where I came from, if you'd seen the version of me that existed at 14 years old, standing in a grocery store with 3 kids under the age of 8, clinging to my jacket while I tried to figure out how to stretch $40 across a week's worth of meals, you'd understand why ordinary feels like a miracle to me. I've been debating whether to share this story for a long time. Years, honestly. Because part of me still feels the guilt that was placed on me before I even understood what guilt was. Part of me still hears my mother's voice saying, "Family is everything, Maya. You don't abandon family." And even now, even after everything, it still takes me a second to remind myself, I didn't abandon anyone. I grew up. And growing up is not a betrayal. But before I tell you what happened, before I get to the part where everything finally broke open, I want you to understand something important. I want you to understand who I was before the story starts. Because a lot of people see stories like mine and they think, how did you let it go on so long? And the honest answer is, when you are raised inside something, when manipulation is the water you've been swimming in since before you could read, you don't see it as manipulation. You see it as love. You see it as family. You see it as just the way things are. So let me take you back. Let me take you back to the house I grew up in a suburb outside of Chicago, where the winters were brutal and the expectations were even colder. My parents, David and Linda Chen, were ambitious people. That's the kindest way I know to describe them. My father was an engineer who spent most of my childhood chasing promotions, working late, traveling for conferences, and building what he always called his legacy. My mother was a real estate agent who was, by all accounts, very good at her job. She was charming and driven and relentless in a way that clients adored and her own children quietly feared. I was born when they were both 23. Young, yes, but not so young that parenthood should have been a surprise. And for the first few years of my life, things were mostly fine. Normal even. We had a house, we had dinners, we had birthdays with cake and candles and photos on the mantelpiece. Then came my brother Daniel when I was 4. Then my sister Grace when I was 7. Then, in what I can only describe as a profound lack of forward planning, my youngest sister Lily was born when I was 9 years old. 4 kids. 2 adults who had bigger plans for themselves than any of us fully understood. And somewhere between Lily's birth and my 10th birthday, I can't pinpoint the exact moment, and I've spent years trying. I stopped being a child in that house. Not officially, not in any way that would have been visible to a teacher or a neighbor, but functionally, quietly, in the ways that matter most, I became the third parent. It started small. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? Maya, can you watch your brother while I take this call? And I would. Because I was 10 and I loved my brother and it seemed reasonable. Then it became, Maya, can you pick up Daniel and Grace from school today? I have a showing. And I would, because I was 11 and I could walk there and back and it felt like being trusted, like being mature, like being good. And I was so desperate to be good. I think that's the thing people don't talk about enough when they discuss parentification. They talk about the labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the caregiving, and yes, all of that is real and all of that matters. But what they don't always talk about is the emotional grooming that makes a child willing to do it. The way certain parents learn, consciously or not, to make their child feel that their love is conditional on their usefulness. That being a good daughter means being a convenient one. That if you complain or push back or say I'm tired, you are selfish, you are ungrateful, you don't understand how hard your parents work. My mother was a master at this. I say that with pain, not cruelty. She was never obviously monstrous. She never screamed or threatened or withheld affection in ways that would have been dramatic enough to name. She was subtle. She was expert. She would simply say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Maya. You're the only one I can really count on." And I was 12 years old and I thought that was love. I thought being needed meant being valued. It took me 2 decades to understand the difference. By the time I was 14, I had a full routine. I woke up at 6 every morning to make breakfast for Daniel, who was 10, and Grace, who was 7, and Lily, who had just turned 5. My parents were often still asleep, or my dad was already gone, or my mom was on a call, half-dressed, waving at me to keep the kids quiet. I packed 3 school lunches. I walked Daniel to the bus stop. I dropped Grace and Lily at their elementary school on my way to my own. I attended my own classes, honors classes actually, because I was a good student when I could stay awake. And then I went back to pick up Lily and Grace, and we'd go home and I'd start on homework. Theirs first, then mine. Then I'd start dinner, because my parents rarely got home before 7 and hungry kids don't wait. And I want you to really sit with that for a second. I was 14 years old. I should have been awkward and boy crazy and worried about what to wear to the school dance. Instead, I was standing at a stove trying to figure out if chicken thighs could stretch into 4 servings or if I needed to make rice too. I was signing permission slips in my mother's handwriting. I was attending Lily's kindergarten play because no one else could go. I missed things. So many things. I missed sleepovers because I couldn't leave the kids alone. I missed after-school clubs because I had pickups. I missed my own 8th grade graduation dinner because Lily had a fever and someone had to stay home, and my mother had a client event she'd been planning for months. I remember sitting on the edge of Lily's bed while she slept, in my good dress, eating crackers, and telling myself it was fine. It was fine. Family came first. That's what you did. I told myself that so many times it became a reflex, a coping mechanism with no expiration date. Now here's something I want to be honest about, because if I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to tell the whole truth. I loved my siblings fiercely. I still do. Daniel and Grace and Lily. They didn't ask for any of this either. They didn't choose to have a sister/substitute mother. And in a lot of ways, the 4 of us built something real together in the cracks of a household where our actual parents kept showing up distracted and unavailable. We had our own language, our own inside jokes, our own rituals, Sunday morning cartoons and frozen waffles, the specific way Lily always wanted her hair braided before school, the elaborate story games Daniel and I would make up for Grace when she was scared of thunderstorms. I want to say that clearly, because some people look at stories like mine and flatten it into pure victimhood. Like I spent every second miserable and oppressed. And the truth is more complicated than that. I loved those kids. Caring for them gave me purpose. At the time, it genuinely felt meaningful. What broke my heart, what took me years to name, was that I never had a choice about it. It was never offered to me as something I could decide. It was simply assumed, automatically assigned to me because I was the oldest, and because I was a girl, and because I was quiet and responsible and wouldn't cause a scene. My worth in that house was directly tied to my function, and the moment I became less convenient, the story about who I was changed entirely. I'm skipping forward now because if I described every year in detail, we'd be here until tomorrow. Let me jump to the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it, even all these years later. I was 16 when my high school counselor, Mrs. Diaz, pulled me aside after class. She'd noticed things, that I looked tired, that I sometimes fell asleep in second period, that I was an obviously capable student who wasn't performing the way she thought I should. She asked me, carefully, about my home life, and I, because I was trained to protect the family image, to never air grievances to outsiders, started to give her the scripted answer. We're fine. My parents work hard. we're a close family. But she waited. She was patient in a way that undid me. And after about 30 seconds of silence, I started crying. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way I always did everything. And I told her in pieces about the mornings, about the pickups, about dinner, about Lily's hair, about the permission slips. Mrs. Diaz was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, very gently, Maya, what you're describing has a name. It's called parentification, and it is not your job. It has never been your job. I remember staring at her like she'd said something in a foreign language, because in my world, it absolutely was my job. It had always been my job. Who else was going to do it? Mrs. Diaz gave me a pamphlet. She asked if I wanted her to contact my parents. I said no, and I meant it, because even then I knew that any intervention would result in a conversation I couldn't survive. My mother's voice, the disappointment, the implication that I'd embarrassed the family by complaining to a stranger. So I took the pamphlet home, read it in the bathroom with the door locked, and then buried it at the bottom of my backpack where no one would find it. But something shifted, very quietly, very slowly, like a crack forming in ice you're still walking across. I started to see things differently. Junior year of high school, I won a full academic scholarship to the University of Illinois. Full ride. Housing, tuition, everything. It was one of the best moments of my life. I remember sitting with the acceptance letter in my hands, shaking, thinking, this is my way out. This is how I get to have a life. I told my parents at dinner that night. My mother smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. And then she said, very calmly, that's wonderful, Maya. We'll have to figure something out with the kids, obviously. Not congratulations, not we're so proud. We'll have to figure something out with the kids. My father nodded without looking up from his phone. I want to ask you, and honestly, I want you to think about this for a second before you keep listening. Have you ever had a genuinely good thing happen to you, and the person whose approval you wanted most responded not with joy, but with inconvenience? Because that moment, that small, quiet, devastating moment, is one I've revisited hundreds of times. It's the moment I understood, somewhere deep and wordless, that to my parents, I was not a daughter they were raising. I was a resource they were managing. But I was 17 and I still needed them. So I stayed quiet. I told myself I could do both. Go to college and still be there for the kids. I told myself it would work out. It didn't work out. I deferred my scholarship. I want to be very clear about what happened, because there's a version of this story where deferral was my choice, where I nobly, freely decided to stay. That's the version my parents told everyone. That's the version my mother still tells, to this day, like it's a testament to my character. The truth is that my mother sat me down 3 weeks before I was supposed to leave for orientation and told me she'd taken on a major client, the biggest listing of her career, and that the timing was terrible. My father had just been offered a project in Denver that would have him traveling Monday through Friday for at least 6 months. Daniel was 12 and struggling in school. Grace was 9 and having some kind of anxiety thing that they hadn't fully addressed. Lily was 6 and had just started first grade. I just need a little more time to get things organized, my mother said. 1 year, Maya. Just 1 year, and then everything will be settled and you can go. She said it with tears in her eyes. My mother, who I had almost never seen cry. She said, I don't know what we'd do without you. I mean that. You hold this family together. And I deferred. 1 year became 2. 2 became 4. By the time I was 21, I had watched my college acceptance expire. I had watched the friends I graduated with post photos of dorm rooms and study abroad programs and graduation ceremonies, while I stood in a school pickup line holding Lily's hand. I had given up a relationship with a boy I genuinely liked because he couldn't understand why I couldn't leave on weekends. I had given up the internship that a professor had specifically connected me to because the dates conflicted with the week my parents were both traveling. And every single time I sacrificed something, my parents had an answer. "You're so mature, Maya. Other kids your age are so selfish. Your siblings are so lucky to have you. You're going to make such a wonderful mother someday. I just don't know what we'd do without you." That last one. That was their weapon of choice. Because hidden inside it was always the same threat. If you leave, everything falls apart, and it will be your fault. I want to stop here for a second because I know some of you listening to this right now are nodding. Not because you've been through exactly this, but because you recognize the shape of it. The way love and obligation get braided together until you can't separate them. The way certain people, especially certain parents, train you to equate your value with your sacrifice. And I want you to know, if that's you, if you're sitting somewhere right now recognizing pieces of your own story in mine, what happened to you was not your fault either. You were a child. You deserved better. And we're going to get to the part where things change, I promise. Keep listening. I turned 24 the year everything started to shift. By then, Daniel was 19 and in community college. Grace was 16 and honestly thriving. She'd found her people, joined the drama club, and had more of a social life than I'd had at 30. Lily was 14 and very much a teenager, which meant she barely wanted to talk to me unless she needed something. And I was 24 years old, working a full-time administrative job at an insurance company, living at home, contributing to the mortgage, doing laundry, making meals, and slowly losing my mind. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean I had started having panic attacks in the car on my way to work. I mean I had developed a habit of sitting in the parking garage for 20 extra minutes after my shift, just to have 20 minutes of silence that no one could interrupt. I mean, I'd started seeing a therapist, a real one, not school mandated, one I'd found and paid for myself. And in our third session, she said to me, very plainly, "Maya, you are experiencing burnout that is consistent with long-term caregiver trauma. You have been in survival mode for so long that you have no idea what your actual needs are." I went home that night and I sat on my bed and I cried for 2 hours. Not sad crying, not even angry crying, just the kind of crying that happens when something true finally lands. I had no idea what my actual needs were. She was completely right. I didn't know what I liked to eat when no one else's preferences had to be factored in. I didn't know what I wanted to do on a Saturday that was entirely mine. I didn't know what kind of person I was outside of being useful to the people around me. I was 24 years old and I was a stranger to myself. The plan didn't come all at once. It built over about a year and a half, the way convictions do. Quietly at first, then louder and louder until you can't ignore them anymore. I started saving money. Quietly, intentionally, in a separate account my parents didn't know about. I researched jobs in other cities. I thought about Portland because I'd always been drawn to the Pacific Northwest in some theoretical way. The trees, the rain, the sense that it was as far from a Chicago suburb as I could reasonably get. I started applying for positions. I had skills, years of administrative work, organizational abilities, a kind of competence under pressure that came from managing 4 people's schedules since I was 11 years old. I was good at my job. I was better than my salary reflected. I got an offer in Portland in March, a project coordinator role at a mid-sized tech company. The salary was real. The benefits were real. The apartment I found online, a small one-bedroom near a park, was real. For 3 weeks, I sat with the offer letter in my email drafts, opening and closing it every day, like it might vanish if I looked at it too long. Then I said yes. And then I had to tell my family. I told my parents on a Sunday afternoon in April. Lily was at a friend's house. Daniel and Grace were both home, which in retrospect I should have thought more carefully about, because what happened next became something they witnessed, and what they witnessed would matter more than I knew. I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, carefully, that I had gotten a job offer in Portland, that I had accepted it, and that I would be moving in 6 weeks. There was a silence that lasted maybe 5 seconds. And then my mother's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It crumpled. Not with sadness, with something harder. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm taking the job," I said. "I'm 26 years old. After everything we've done for you," she said. "After everything this family has sacrificed." And I want to pause here because I need you to appreciate the particular architecture of that sentence. After everything this family has sacrificed. As though the sacrifice had been shared equally. As though the giving and the taking had been distributed fairly across everyone at the table. "Mom," I said. I was trying to stay calm. My therapist had coached me on this conversation. I'd practiced it. "I've been here my whole life. I've done everything that was asked of me and more. I just need—" "You need?" she laughed, not warmly. "Do you know what I needed at 26? I needed help with 4 kids and a household and—" "That wasn't my responsibility," I said. And I know those 4 words landed like a grenade because I watched her face go absolutely still. "Excuse me?" "It was never my responsibility. I was a child." My father, who had been silent this whole time in his particular way, not absent, just strategically uninvolved, finally spoke. He said, "Maya, you're being incredibly selfish right now." And Grace, from the hallway, Grace, who was 18 years old and had been listening without us knowing, said, quietly but clearly, "She's not being selfish. You are." I think about that moment a lot. Grace standing in the doorway in her drama club hoodie, saying the thing I'd never been brave enough to say. And then she walked past the table and upstairs to her room without another word, and the 3 of us sat in the silence that felt like the air after lightning. That night, my mother came to my room. She didn't yell. She never yelled. She sat on the edge of my bed like I was 7 years old and she was going to read me a story. And she said, in her quietest, most devastating voice, "If you walk out that door, I want you to know that you are walking away from this family. I hope whatever you're chasing is worth it." I looked at her for a long time and then I said, "I'm not chasing anything, Mom. I'm just finally trying to live." She left without responding and I sat there in the dark for a long time and I felt 2 things simultaneously. The most profound grief I'd ever experienced and the very first edges of something that felt, terrifyingly, like freedom. The 6 weeks before I left were the coldest of my life. My mother spoke to me in the specific punishing way she had, not with anger, but with the withdrawal of warmth, efficient, transactional. She'd asked me to pass the salt like I was a roommate she'd just met. My father was largely absent, which was, I realized, his default setting for anything emotionally difficult. Daniel sat with me in the kitchen one night while I was packing boxes. He was 21 by then, quietly watching me tape up a box of books. He said, "Are you really leaving?" "Yeah," I said, "I am." He was quiet for a while, then, "I'm sorry I didn't help more when we were kids." I looked up at him and I said, "Danny, you were a kid." "So were you," he said. I had to look back at my box because I wasn't ready to cry in front of him. But that mattered. That mattered a lot. Grace texted me the day before I left. Just, I see you. I always saw you. Have the most amazing life. I saved that text. I still have it. Lily didn't say goodbye. She was 14 and furious in the way only 14-year-olds can be. And I think she genuinely didn't understand what was happening or why. She'd been the youngest, the most insulated, the one who'd always had the most, because Grace and Daniel and I had, in our different ways, tried to make sure she didn't feel the gaps. She'd grown up thinking our family was normal. Leaving felt to her like a personal rejection. I understood that. It still hurt. I drove to Portland over 3 days with butterscotch in a carrier on the passenger seat and everything I owned in the back of a rented van. I cried through most of Illinois. I stopped crying somewhere around Iowa. By the time I hit Oregon, I had my windows down and a playlist I'd made specifically for this trip. And somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, with the Cascades visible in the distance, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for as long as I could remember. I'm not going to pretend the first year was easy. It wasn't. I was lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated, because my loneliness in Chicago had been the loneliness of never having space to myself. And this was a different kind, the loneliness of too much space and not enough people who knew my name. I had to learn, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to exist for myself, how to make decisions without calculating their impact on 3 other people, how to sleep past 6 in the morning without guilt. My therapist in Portland, Dr. Reyes, used a phrase in our second session that I've never forgotten. She said, "You've spent your entire developmental life in service of other people's needs. Part of what we're doing now is essentially going back and raising yourself." I was 26 years old and I was learning to raise myself. When I say it like that, it sounds sad. And some days it was, but mostly it was extraordinary. The first time I cooked a meal that was exactly what I wanted to eat, with no adjustments for anyone else's preferences, and sat at my tiny kitchen table and ate it in silence while reading a book, I almost couldn't believe it was allowed. The first time I made plans on a Saturday and kept them without cancelling because someone needed something, I cried. Genuinely cried. Not from sadness, from something that I later understood was relief. My parents and I went almost entirely no contact for the first 2 years. Not because I made a dramatic declaration. I never blocked them, never sent a letter. I just stopped making the effort. And they didn't reach out, which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of the relationship that had existed before I left. If the communication required my labor to sustain it, it wasn't really a relationship. It was a service arrangement. Daniel texted occasionally, practical things at first. Did you make it okay? Is the apartment nice? What's Portland like? And then gradually more personal. He'd started dating someone, a girl named Priya, and she'd apparently made some observations about our family dynamic that had sent him into his own spiral of reflection. He started therapy. He told me about it almost apologetically, like he wasn't sure I'd approve. I told him I thought it was one of the best things he could possibly do. Grace was thriving. She got into a good theater program, moved into the dorms, started building the kind of vivid, expansive young adult life that she absolutely deserved. She texted me more regularly than anyone. Funny observations about her professors, voice memos of her singing parts she was working on, long late-night messages about life and love, and what she was beginning to understand about our childhood. Those conversations meant everything to me. Lily was the one I worried about. She was 15, then 16, still at home, still in the middle of whatever was happening in that house, without the buffer of older siblings. I thought about her often. I wondered if she was okay. I wondered if she was being asked to step into the role I'd left behind. I found out later, much later, that she was. It was Grace who first told me, about a year into my time in Portland, that our mother had started putting more domestic pressure on Lily after I left. Nothing as extreme as what I'd experienced. There were only two of them left at home by then, just Lily and whatever version of my parents showed up on any given day. But enough. Enough that Lily, at 15, was being made to feel responsible for my mother's emotional state. Enough that she was spending her teenage years walking on eggshells. Grace said, "I think Lily is starting to understand, Maya. I think she's starting to get it." I didn't reach out to Lily right away. I didn't feel like it was my place to insert myself. She needed to come to her own understanding in her own time, and the worst thing I could have done was swoop in with my narrative and color hers. So I waited. And then, when Lily was 17, she sent me a message at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It said, "Maya, can I call you? I just need to talk to someone who gets it." We talked for 3 hours. I cried. She cried more. She told me things about those last 2 years at home that broke my heart in new places. She told me she'd started to understand, slowly, painfully, that what had happened to me was real, that I had lost something real, and that she felt guilty for being so angry at me when I left. "You didn't abandon us," she said. "I understand that now. They told us you abandoned us, but you were just trying to survive." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, Lily. That means more to me than you know." "I should have said goodbye," she said. "I'm sorry." We stayed on the phone until past 2 in the morning, and when we finally hung up, I sat by my window looking out at the streetlight through the rain, and I felt something shift in a way that was hard to name, like a piece of something returning that I hadn't realized was missing. I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving that changed everything, because if this story has a turning point, if there's a moment where all the threads come together and the real confrontation finally happens, it's this one. It was 3 years after I'd left. I was 29. My parents had reached out sporadically during that time. Birthday texts, a stiff phone call at Christmas where my mother asked about my job, and my father said almost nothing, and we collectively pretended everything was fine. I had responded in kind, civil, functional, the bare minimum of contact that allowed everyone to claim we were still a family. Then, in October, my father called and asked if I'd come home for Thanksgiving. Not my mother, my father, which was unusual enough that it gave me pause. He sounded older on the phone, quieter. Something in his voice had changed in a way I couldn't fully identify. He said, "I know things have been difficult, but your mother misses you. We all do. Lily is going to be home. I think it would mean a lot." I talked to my therapist about it. I talked to Grace, who was coming back too. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and then I said yes. Not because I expected a magical reconciliation, not because I'd forgotten anything, but because I was a different person now. 3 years stronger, 3 years more rooted in myself, and I thought I could handle it. And because Lily was going to be there, and after our phone call, I desperately wanted to see her in person. I flew into Chicago on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Grace picked me up from the airport, and we got coffee and sat in the parking lot of a Dunkin' Donuts for an hour before we were ready to drive to the house, which should tell you everything you need to know about both of our emotional states. "Just so you know," Grace said, holding her coffee with both hands, "Daniel told Mom some things last month about how we all feel, about what our childhood was like." I went still. "What kind of things?" "The truth kind," she said simply. "How did she take it?" Grace gave me a look that was equal parts exhaustion and dark humor. "About as well as you'd expect." The house looked the same from the outside. Same blue shutters, same cracked driveway that my father had been planning to repave since 2012. But when I walked inside, something felt different, a little hollow, like the confidence had gone out of it. Lily practically knocked me over when I came through the door. She was 18 now, not the furious 14-year-old I'd left behind, and she hugged me like she was trying to make up for 4 years of missed hugs all at once. I held on just as tight. My mother came into the hallway. She looked at me for a moment and something moved across her face that was complicated and layered, and I couldn't fully read it. Then she said, "I'm glad you came." Not warmly, but genuinely, I think. My father came and shook my hand in the strange formal way he had and said, "Maya, good to see you." We sat down for drinks before dinner, and for about an hour we did what American families do at holidays. We talked about neutral things: Lily's college applications, Grace's theater program, Daniel's girlfriend Priya, who everyone had apparently decided they loved, the weather, the traffic, the careful, practiced performance of a family that is fine. And then, during dinner, something happened. I don't remember exactly what started it. Something small. Lily making a joke, something offhand about how Grace and I had basically co-parented her through middle school. And my mother's face tightened in a way I recognized from 1,000 childhood moments. The look that meant something was being said that she didn't want said. The look that preceded a redirect, a dismissal, a change of subject. But Lily wasn't a child anymore, and she'd had 3 years of her own slow reckoning. "You don't have to look like that, Mom," Lily said, quietly, evenly. "It's the truth." "I don't know what you're referring to." "Maya raised us," Lily said, like functionally. She was our parent, and she gave up her whole life to do it, and we all just let her. The table went silent in the specific way tables go silent when something true and long buried has just been said out loud in a room full of people who've been pretending it wasn't true. My mother set down her fork. "That's a very dramatic reading of—" "Mom," that was Daniel, calm, firm, "stop." My mother looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "We talked about this," he continued. "Priya and I, and me and Grace, and me and Dr. Patterson, and honestly all of us. We've all been processing this for a while now. And we're not saying it to hurt you, but we're also not going to keep pretending it didn't happen." My father, to his credit, said nothing. He was looking at the table, but he was listening. "Maya," Daniel said, turning to me, "I want to say this in front of everyone. I'm sorry. For real. I'm sorry for every time we took what you gave us and didn't see what it cost you. You deserved better than what this family asked of you." I couldn't speak. I genuinely could not form words. Grace reached over and put her hand over mine on the table. And then Lily said, "And this is the moment I will carry with me for the rest of my life." Lily said, "You didn't abandon us, Maya. You survived us, and I am so grateful you got out." My mother left the table. She went to the kitchen and we could hear her moving around in there, the deliberate clatter of clearing things that didn't need clearing, the particular busyness of a person who doesn't know how to stay in a hard conversation. We let her go. My father stayed, and when it was just the 4 of us, the 4 kids who had navigated this house together, who had covered for each other and raised each other and loved each other in the complicated, imperfect way that you love someone you're also surviving alongside, my father cleared his throat. He said, "I've been thinking about some things lately." None of us said anything. I knew I wasn't pleasant the way I should have been. I told myself I was providing for the family, that the work was for all of you. And I think— He paused, visibly struggling. I think I knew, somewhere, that we were asking too much of Maya. I think I knew. And I chose not to look at it too closely, because it was convenient not to. Silence. "I'm not asking for absolution," he said. "I just want you to know I know. I see it now, and I'm sorry." I looked at my father, this man I'd spent my whole life trying to impress and failing to reach, and I felt something I didn't expect. Not warmth exactly, not forgiveness, not yet, but something like the beginning of an opening, a door I hadn't known was there. "Thank you," I said, "for saying that." My mother came back eventually. She sat down. She didn't apologize, not that night, not in words, and maybe not ever in the clean, complete way that part of me still wants. But she asked me about Portland. She asked about my job, my apartment, my cat. She asked what the trees were like in November in the Pacific Northwest, and I told her in careful pieces, and she listened. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't a Hollywood ending. My family is not magically healed, and I am not going to stand here and tell you that one Thanksgiving dinner untangled 30 years of complex and painful dynamics. That would be a lie. But something changed that night, something real. I'm back in Portland now, in my apartment with butterscotch and my houseplants and the rain against the window. I'm 34 years old. I have a job I love, a life I built from scratch, and a sense of myself that I had to fight for in ways that no one should have to fight for their own identity. I'm in therapy. I'm healthy. I have real friendships, slowly built, carefully chosen, deeply valued. I have a partner actually, which I'll save for another story because this one is already long enough. But I have love. Real, uncomplicated, chosen love. And that is not something I take lightly. My siblings and I talk regularly. Daniel and Priya just got engaged and they asked me to be in the wedding, and I said yes before they'd even finished the question. Grace is in her final year of her MFA program, and she sends me voice memos of songs she's writing, and they make me cry almost every time. Lily is in college now, 2,000 miles from home, and she sends me photos of her campus and her dorm and her friends, with the energy of someone discovering that the world is enormous and full of good things. I see pieces of myself in her, the version of me I never got to be at that age. And instead of being sad about it, I've learned to just be glad it exists somewhere. Glad she gets to have it. My parents and I have a relationship. It's not what I wished for when I was a little girl, but it's honest now in a way it wasn't before. My mother called me last month on my birthday, and she said, for the first time in 34 years of being my mother, "I'm proud of you, Maya, for the life you've made." I don't say that enough. I held the phone very still and I said, "Thank you, Mom," and I meant it. I've been thinking about why I wanted to share this story, and I think it's because I spent a very long time believing that the life I was living was the only life available to me, that I had obligations I couldn't put down, that needing space was selfishness, that wanting my own life was betrayal. If you are listening to this and any part of it sounds familiar, if you have been the one who takes care of everyone, the one who is always available, the one who is told that your needs are inconvenient, I want to say something to you directly. What you are carrying is not yours to carry alone. The people who love you will still love you when you put it down. And the people who only love you when you're useful to them, that's not love, that's leverage. You are not responsible for saving people who won't save themselves. You are not selfish for having needs. You are not abandoning anyone by choosing to live. I know that sounds simple. I know it sounds like something you might read on a motivational poster and roll your eyes at. But I also know from experience that sometimes the simple things are the hardest ones to actually believe. That sometimes you need to hear them 100 times before they finally land. So if this is the first time you've heard it, or the 100th, I hope it lands today. Before I go, I want to say thank you for listening. I know this was a long one. I know it was heavy in places. If you've ever been in a situation like this, if you've ever been the family caretaker, the one who was expected to give and give and give until there was nothing left, I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments. Not because misery loves company, but because I spent so long thinking I was alone in this, and I wasn't. And maybe some of you feel that way too. And if you watched this all the way through, if you stayed until the end, then you know by now that the story doesn't end with my family destroyed, or with me bitter and isolated on some mountaintop of justified resentment. It ends with something messier and more human than that. It ends with a table, and 4 people who found their way back to honesty, and a father who finally said, "I see it," and a mother who finally said, "I'm proud of you," and 3 siblings who stood up for their sister before she could stand up for herself. It ends with me, 34 years old, sitting in my own apartment, living my own life, writing my own story. It ends with the thing I waited 2 decades for: silence that belongs to me.